Well, hello again. It's Andrew Doubleday yet again, and today we're looking at the Gospel Lectionary reading for Sunday the 25th of July. In our last session, we looked, as we were in Mark's Gospel, at the beginning and the end, the bookends around the miracles of the feeding of the 5,000 and of Jesus walking on the water, which I thought was a little bit odd. And even more oddly, this week we're looking at John's account of those two miracles. So it's like last week we were looking at what happened before and what happened after, according to Mark. This week we've taken out Mark's bit and put John's bit in, and we're considering that. So we will go with that. And so we pick up the narrative of John chapter 6. Verses 1 through to 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place. So they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. Also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who was to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and to take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough, because the strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the water and coming near to the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land towards which they were going. I'm not going to talk about the veracity or otherwise of these miracles. Everyone has their own view about whether or not they really happened. And nothing I could say is likely to be useful in changing anyone's mind. It's a bit like vaccinations. You're either for them or against them, and once you've mapped out our own territory, there's very little chance of being argued into an alternative position. Instead, I want to focus on Jesus himself. What might be motivating him, going through his heart and mind. Now we're told in John's Gospel that the Passover is near at hand. It's Israel's main feast. It's marking Israel's liberation from slavery, that central theme of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Passover narrative follows with 40 years in the desert being fed on manna, the gift from God. There are some parallels here. According to John, the people are looking for signs. I want to suggest that people who are happy and contented would rather things stay just as they are. They're not looking for disruption. On the other hand, people look for signs, John's word for miracles, when they're unhappy, verging on desperate, when life isn't going the way that they had hoped. It seems that there were lots of people in this state. They've come out to Jesus in the wilderness, in the open territory, by the thousands. And we remember Jesus' response as Mark's Gospel articulates it. Jesus sees the crowd and has compassion on them. Splanchnizomai, if you remember from our last session, the sense of his heart turning over within him. He sees the sense of pain, he sees the loss, he sees the need, and all he wants to do is reach toward them, to bring restoration, to bring wholeness, to fill their lives with hope and purpose and meaning, to make a difference so that they can get up and embrace life and life in its fullness. Notice here in John's Gospel that Jesus' first concern is so practical and ordinary, the state of the people's stomachs. His commitment on his part to their well-being, to their wholeness, that they're going to be able to celebrate the Passover, which is close, the memorial of their liberation in good health, with hopefully not gnawing empty guts, but with a sense of gratitude, because they're already been filled in some way. And what we see Jesus doing here, I want to suggest, is expressing the abundant generosity of God. He's not concerned about whether or not they're deserving, whether they're good enough, holy enough. They're hungry, and that's enough. Or if not yet hungry, they soon will be, because they're going to be there all day. Jesus is concerned about the most basic, everyday needs of the people. Now, if you've been listening to me for some time, you'll be recognizing the same basic message. It's expressing the love of Jesus as a reflection of the love of God. And I want to emphasize that today. Let's hear some more of Jesus' words from John's Gospel. In John 5:19 he says this, "I tell you the truth, I can do nothing by myself. I can only do what I see the Father doing, because whatever the Father does, I also do." In that great chapter of John 14 he says this in verse 9, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you are not just my own. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me." The reason I'm labouring this is because we so readily draw a distinction between Jesus and God, and imagine that God is harsh, judgmental, and looking for every opportunity to punish, while Jesus is compassionate, kind, generous, looking for every reason to forgive and to seek the highest and best good of the other, every reason to restore and to make whole. That kind and compassionate Jesus somehow gets between this angry God and us to protect us from his wrath. That's how I grew up, and I'm sure that there are many of you out there who have that kind of lingering image in your hearts and minds. And Jesus is telling us that we've misrepresented God. That when we see Jesus, when we hear Jesus, when we understand Jesus, we get the fullest sense of the heart and mind of God. They are in perfect sync. They're both on the same page. Jesus only does what he sees the Father doing. When Jesus speaks, he expresses the heart and the mind of God. When Jesus reaches out in compassion, he reaches out in the compassion and generosity and kindness of God. When Jesus acts in the best interest to bring fullness of life, He does it as a reflection of who God is. And so again in this passage we see Jesus seeing people through the eyes of their need, through the eyes of their lived reality, rather than through the eyes of judgment and looking for reasons to find fault. My hunch is that Jesus has the Passover in mind, that great feast which points to liberation, a new beginning, and all that followed. Of God's provision of manna in those desert wanderings, the manna in the desert, the miraculous, which came to seem so ordinary. And as the crowd are fed, for some it too seems so ordinary. It's just food. It's just bread and fish, part of their staple. It doesn't appear miraculous, though to many it did. Our difficulty is that ordinary miracles are happening around us all the time. I just want to suggest that to you. We're just not noticing. There could be so many possible examples. I think, for example, that the miracle of conception and birth, I call it a miracle. The gift of life is so common, so universal, yet so wonderful and miraculous. While we understand something of the mechanics and have the ability to make synthetic organisms, that capacity to create that spark of life itself continues to elude us. One day, who knows, but I'll be surprised. Yet life itself and its abundance and its fecundity, its universal ordinariness, continues to be a source of wonder to me. And for me it all expresses the generosity and graciousness of God. A generosity, graciousness, kindness, compassion reflected in the person of Jesus. God bless you.